At the center of the narrative, standing before the healing and eternally after it, is Jesus, the giver of sight and the very light of the world by which true sight becomes possible. Underlying this discussion of light and sight and blindness is a question about who Jesus is. And this question extends across all the texts that we use during Lent. In the preceding 2 chapters of this gospel, Jesus is observing the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Siloam, the Pool of Siloam, where the man born blind is sent to wash his eyes, was the source of water for some of the ceremonies of the festival. And Jesus had already invited the thirsty to come to him and drink on the great day of the festival in 7:37 to 38. Or look it up. Actually, you do want to look it up. But I'll get to that in a minute. Light was also an important theme, and Jesus declares himself the light of the world at the festival in 8:12 and again here in verse 5. A theme of sinfulness also runs through the story. Who is sinful, and what constitutes sin? Sinfulness as a secondary theme is introduced at the very beginning of this text in the question by the disciples. And notice it was the disciples and not the Pharisees. When they see the man and ask Jesus whose sin was the source of his blindness, his or his parents'. Jesus rejects this interpretation of the man's blindness. He interprets it instead as an opening for the works of God to be revealed. The Pharisees discuss Jesus' sinfulness in verse 16 and again in 24 to 25 and 31. In verse 34, they return to the sinfulness of the man born blind with another reference to his birth in sin. However, the story ends with Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees, whose sins remain, because unlike the blind man who recognizes the grace of God and Jesus' bestowal of sight and light in his blindness, the Pharisees insist that they see and know everything already. They are closed to the gift of Jesus, who could only give sight to those who know they are spiritually blind. Sight and water also come into play in the encounter with Nicodemus. That was the text 2 weeks ago, but I don't think we did that here. Maybe you heard it somewhere else. It is the proper text for Lent. But anyway, there is here Nicodemus, who was also a Pharisee, is quick to say that we know about Jesus only to find that what he thinks he knows cannot begin to contain the enormity of the gift of God that is Jesus, which will culminate in his lifting up on the cross and the resurrection. Now in verse 13 it says, they led him. Now, Greek syntax and English syntax are a little bit different. A literal translation from the Greek would be, led they him. Farther to the front of the sentence is more emphasis. And the word they use here has connotations so that we can read this was not voluntary. He was dragged before the Pharisees. The Pharisees were a sect of Judaism that was focused on the law and rejected any attempt to reinterpret it, as Jesus does frequently. That's why there was so much animosity between the Pharisees and Jesus and his followers. This man is being used as a foil to further this conflict. This story about light in conflict with the opposing powers of unrelenting darkness is surrounded and colored by vivid images of what the darkness will do. With the attempted stoning of Jesus immediately preceding this chapter, and then the shepherd discourse with its references to Jesus laying down his life immediately following. The conflict with the Pharisees shapes the entire central section of this passage. You notice Jesus is missing through most of this text. First, as they encounter the man born blind, then as they interrogate his parents, and finally as they interrogate the man born blind a second time, and then expel him. Since I am a student and misery loves company, sometimes I like to assign homework. So here's yours today. I want you to read chapter 10 today. For extra credit, you can read chapters 7 through 10. And if you read the whole gospel, I'll give you a hug whenever it's safe. You'll probably have to remind me. I want to encourage you to read the whole gospel. The blind man is more than one whom Jesus heals. He is one of Jesus' sheep and a member of the fold. Like the sheep, the blind man hears Jesus' voice. Like the shepherd, Jesus finds the blind man when he has been cast out. Jesus provides for the blind man much more than sight. He provides for him what he, as a good shepherd, gives to all of his sheep: the protection of his fold, the blessing of needed pasture, and the gift of abundant life. As a result, hearing and seeing are much more than ways by which one recognizes or believes in Jesus. They are in fact, expressions of relationship with Jesus, and expressions of relationship with Jesus means also a relationship with God. Sight and hearing are critical for both the story and the speech to recognize Jesus and God at work in the healing of the blind man. Without both chapters together, one sense is afforded greater significance over the other, and the blind man's sight is then reduced to mere example or miracle. In fact, he embodies all of that which Jesus speaks of in chapter 10. As the attitude of the religious authorities hardens and darkens, the man born blind grows in insight, even through their questioning, so that the narrative tells parallel tales of spiritual and physical blindness and sight. The man moves from identifying his healer only as the man called Jesus, to replying, when pressed hard by the Pharisees, that Jesus is a prophet, and then, when further pressed, that he must be from God. Perhaps his remarkable wisdom and calm shows that Jesus' touch bestowed more than just sight. Finally, when the man has been driven out, Jesus, who we know from chapter 6, verse 37, will never drive out those whom God gives him, finds the man and reveals himself fully to him as the Son of the human. You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he. The man bows down before him in worship, and this is the only time in this gospel when anyone does this. We ask how the narrative reflects in our lives today, the lives of the people in front of the text, for whom the narrative is also life-shaping. In some places, even now, it is risky to be a Christian. In some places where Christianity is often, sadly, too tame or too much in line with the prejudices and the desires of the powers that be to be threatening to anyone, it is sometimes no longer socially desirable to be a Christian. Is it socially desirable here? In some communities, such as the LGBTQ community, it is at best unpopular to be Christian because of the way so many churches have treated them. I've actually heard a number of my friends refer to themselves as closet Christians. That's a pretty sad commentary. As we ponder about the appropriateness of this text for contemporary audiences, we notice that the text seems to combat the idea that sickness is related to sin, In an age that has seen the spread of AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases, which for many people represent a sinful lifestyle, it would be wise not to make this mistake ourselves. Sin is not an excuse for or a cause of sickness. To paraphrase Jesus, sickness comes on the righteous and on the unrighteous, as our current crisis shows. The text also seems to reject all kinds of determinisms. That is, the idea that one's race, culture, social status, or education, among many other things, determines one's moral standing. An example is the fact that most of the inmates in the U.S. prison system are people of color. This should not be seen as a commentary on their morality, but rather as proof of the racial prejudices of our society when it comes to deciding who goes to prison and who doesn't. At the very least, John insists, as do all of the New Testament writers, that we are living in an alternative reality that sets us apart. Do we live like that? Now, one of the hardest things I find about writing a sermon is giving it a title. However, at the top of my page, I have to put something, just for me to recognize it. So I put up there, blind man cured, because there's a difference between healing and curing. There's no doubt that this man has been cured. He has regained his sight. Back when I was young, I prayed nearly every night that God would take this desire to be a girl away, that I would be cured. As you can witness today, that didn't happen. I was not cured. For a long time, I assumed that my faith was not strong enough to heal me. But as my relationship with God grew, I began to realize that God had healed me. God provided a way for me to accept and embrace my identity, and even to come to know that God called me to be a woman, just as I am called to be here in the pulpit. This healing was done mostly through people in the church. Some of them are here today. I think this was a way for God to show me that my life would be in the church, helping others to be healed. A cure is something that you can give, but healing is something you do. It is unfortunate that we don't get to witness the actual healing in this story. With this reclamation of sight, the person can rejoin the community as a contributing member. Author Kathy Black explains that in biblical times there was one sense of being in the community that was most crucial, and illness or disability interfered with being within the community. This is where the healing is. He can be welcomed back into his community, and there he can also tell his story. Today we view illness and disability much differently, and we need to be careful about projecting this back onto texts such as this. I hope that my little story illustrates this. It is not that my faith was too weak to effect a cure. It's that with God, there's a difference between healing and curing. I have no doubt that God could have cured me, but as Jesus declares, I was born this way, that the work of God might be revealed. I was healed when I came to understand this. My ability to be in community is not hindered in any way by my identity. It is those around me who occasionally rebuke me and tell me to shut up. But Christ calls me, and I must answer. Well, there's one person here who tells me to shut up too. But it's funny, you won't know for an answer. It's easy to read this story and of other healings that bemoan our weakness of faith. Certainly there are stories outside of the Bible about remarkable cures, but it is no longer true that a person with disability cannot be a contributing member of society, and certainly not that they need to be kept away. Today we have many marvelous ways to help people be in their community, however you wish to define that term. In this sense, healing has new connotations for today's society, and it becomes everyone's concerns. My friend Kirk Langsett declared, "The problem isn't that people go to the wrong church. The problem is that the church is wrong whenever it makes a person feel unwelcome, unworthy, or unacceptable simply because of who they are." Chris Sugden goes even further. Being human should be a sufficient reason for being treated with dignity. Sadly, some people, far from being respected, are considered to be living lives not worth sustaining. Jesus demonstrates differently and calls each of us to help sustain all human life. As the fruit of Jesus' vine, we are on display and stand for something other, for an alternative way of life. If we never find ourselves at odds with all the powerful and the status quo, that perhaps should give us pause. The blind man, unlike his parents, has the courage again and again to say what he knows, to speak truth to power, to tell what he can about the amazing grace with which he has been touched. Jesus, the light of the world, is a mystery. Except that while the whole world around the blind man is confused, the blind man is quietly abandoned by everyone but Jesus. Finally, notice Jesus' most telling action. Jesus comes to the man in his blindness and gives him vision. He does not quiz the blind man about anything. Only later, when Jesus returns, does he use the word believe. There are no conditions to Christ's healing. This is fundamentally a story about grace, and the blind man sums it up beautifully for all of us. One thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see. Amen.